At my son's wedding, they replaced my seat with a trash can. That was the moment I realized I hadn't lost him that day. I'd been losing him for years. The morning of Jake's wedding, I woke up before the sun. The light hadn't even touched the curtains, and yet I was already in front of the mirror, curling my thinning hair, pressing the soft fabric of my dress, applying the faintest lipstick. The house was silent. My hands trembled not out of nerves, but out of hope. I had imagined this day 1,000 times. My only son, my Jake, standing at the altar, and me, his mother, seated proudly in the front row, holding back tears as he exchanged vows with the woman he loved. I'd spent so many years raising him alone after Harold died. Working night shifts at the diner, skipping meals to afford his tuition, mending his pants while he slept. This wedding was more than a ceremony to me. It was a promise fulfilled. I even wore the same pale blue dress I had saved for years. It was the one Harold had always said made my eyes sparkle. I remember the way he looked at me in it the night of our 25th anniversary. He was gone now, but I felt him with me that morning, whispering, "Go see your boy become a man." The venue was a beautiful vineyard on the edge of town, surrounded by hills and lined with white roses. As I approached, my heart swelled. I held the embroidered handkerchief Jake gave me when he graduated. It said, "To the best mom in the world." Guests were arriving, laughing, greeting one another. Everyone was dressed like a dream. I looked around for familiar faces, but none met my gaze. No one from my side of the family had been invited. Still, I smiled. This day wasn't about me. It was about Jake. As I entered the seating area, I paused at the entrance where an usher stood. "Name?" he asked. "Clara. Clara Thompson, mother of the groom." He flipped through a laminated chart and frowned. I don't see you on the front family rows." "You sure you're listed there?" "Ah, yes, I'm his mother. Surely there's a seat." He looked again, then pointed. "You can sit near the back, right over there." I followed his gesture. At the very edge of the courtyard near the catering station, tucked beside a large trash can, sat a folding chair, a single chair. I stood frozen. At first I thought it was a mistake, a terrible oversight. But as I watched Kara's family ushered to the plush, decorated seats in the front chairs adorned with silk bows and roses, I realized this wasn't an error. This was a message. I tried to find Jake, to meet his eye, to wave, to do anything, but he was nowhere in sight. When Kara appeared dazzling in white lace, I clutched the handkerchief tighter. And when the music played and Jake finally stepped into view, I stood smiling, proud, despite everything. But he never looked at me. He passed by me as if I were invisible. A stranger. And when he took Kara's hands, he whispered something that made her laugh, and she glanced in my direction with the slightest smirk. The ceremony began. I sat down slowly on the folding chair. A breeze lifted the hem of my dress. The trash can beside me rattled its lid ajar. They had replaced my seat with a trash can, and no one said a word. During the vows, they thanked Kara's parents. They were praised for their support, their love, their generosity. Kara's mother wept openly and was handed tissues by the bridesmaids. There was no mention of me, no gesture, not even my name. When the officiant asked if anyone objected, I didn't speak, but inside I was screaming. I stayed through the reception. I don't know why. Maybe I still hoped. Maybe I thought Jake would notice, that he would pull me aside and say, "Mom, I'm sorry, it was Kara's planning, not mine." Or that he'd save a dance for me, or even a photo. But as the night wore on, I became background noise. No one spoke to me. I was given a plate of food that tasted like cardboard and sat alone by the bar. Even the photographer seemed to avoid pointing his lens in my direction. Near midnight, I gathered my things. No goodbyes, no hugs. I left as quietly as I came. In the parking lot, I sat in my car with the engine off and the radio silent. I looked down at the handkerchief, now stained with tears, and I thought of Harold. How he would have never allowed this. How he would have stood beside me, demanded a place. But he wasn't here. I was alone. On my son's wedding day, I was discarded like the trash beside me. I drove home in the dark, each mile widening the space between us. And when I entered my little kitchen, I placed the handkerchief on the table and whispered, "No more. No more waiting. No more hoping. No more letting love make me small." That was the day I began again. The morning after Jake's wedding, I didn't open the curtains. The world outside was bright and loud and full of congratulations I didn't deserve to hear. I sat in the kitchen holding the same teacup I used to cradle when Jake was small and colicky, the one I would sip from with one hand while bouncing him on my hip with the other. That cup had cracks now just like me, and like me, it still held things. Mostly sorrow, sleep hadn't come. Instead, memories flooded in uninvited but unstoppable. Jake was born on a freezing November evening. The hospital heater was broken, and I remember wrapping him in Harold's old army coat to keep him warm. The nurse had frowned, said the coat smelled of sweat and smoke, but Jake had stopped crying the second I tucked him in it. Maybe he felt the presence of the man who would never hold him. Harold died in a car crash when Jake was 3 months old. We were supposed to grow old together, Harold and I. Watch Jake graduate, get married, have kids. But life had other plans. And I had no choice but to become both mother and father overnight. I didn't complain. I didn't cry in front of Jake. Every bottle I warmed, every night I stayed up while he was sick, every shift I picked up at the diner. I did it with one goal in mind, his future. When Jake turned 6, he asked why he didn't have a daddy like the other kids. I told him, because you were so special, it took everything in me to bring you here, and now you have all of me. He hugged me that night and said, "You're better than 2 parents, Mommy. You're my team." That memory. It lives in the same place in my heart where last night's pain now echoes. I remember taking Jake to the school book fair when he was 10. He didn't want books. He wanted a shiny plastic watch that cost too much. I told him we couldn't afford it. He didn't cry. He just said, "Maybe Santa will get it." That night, I skipped dinner and walked 3 miles to the dollar store to buy that watch. I wrapped it in tissue paper and left it by his pillow with a note that read, "Time flies when you're loved." He wore that thing until the strap broke. When he was 12, Jake broke his arm trying to climb the neighbor's tree. The doctor said he needed surgery. I sat outside the operating room praying to every god I'd ever heard of. I signed the papers without blinking. Took 3 extra shifts that week to pay for what the insurance wouldn't cover. I didn't sleep for 4 days. But when he came home, cast signed by every classmate, smile wide as ever, he said, "You're my hero, Mom." I didn't want to be his hero. I just wanted to be his safe place. When Jake got into university first in our family, I cried into a towel so he wouldn't hear. I packed his bags, made sure he had everything, even stupid things like throat lozenges and laundry quarters. He hugged me at the train station and said, "I'll make you proud." And he did. Even when he drifted, called, less visited, only on holidays, I held no grudge. That's how sons are, I told myself. They outgrow your lap, but never your heart. Then Kara entered the picture. She was beautiful, polished. Her parents owned a string of antique stores. She didn't smile easily. She called me Miss Thompson, even after I asked her to call me Clara. When I cooked for her, she barely touched her plate. When I gifted her a hand-knit scarf, she left it behind on the coat rack. Jake said, "She's just not used to all this." I asked, "All what?" He said, the simple life. I knew then what I wasn't supposed to know, that I embarrassed them, that I was someone to manage, not embrace. Still, I tried. I showed up. I smiled. I offered to help with the wedding plans. Kara said they already had a team. I offered to contribute. Jake told me gently, "Just enjoy the day, Mom. Don't stress." And I did. I pressed my dress, polished my shoes, wrapped the gift with trembling fingers, only to sit beside a trash can. Do you know what it's like to realize someone has rewritten your story in their own image? To take everything you've built from scratch, every sacrifice, every scar, and edit it out like you were never there. I do. And yet, even in that moment, even in the humiliation, I searched for his eyes. I wanted him to look at me and remember. Remember the scraped knees I kissed, the homework I stayed up to help him finish, the way I sang to him when monsters hid under his bed, but he never looked back. After the wedding, when I got home and placed that wrinkled handkerchief on the kitchen table, I felt something shift. Not just sadness, not just betrayal, clarity. My love had never been about being thanked, or seated in the front row, or named in a speech. It had been about holding someone long enough for them to walk on their own, and sometimes they walk away. But now I had to learn how to walk alone again. Not as a mother, not as a wife, but as Clara. Part 3, Unseen Wounds. When love starts to shift, I first noticed it in the way Jake started talking. It wasn't what he said it was, what he didn't. Our Sunday calls, once filled with laughter and stories about his week, became shorter. His voice, once eager, now clipped. The last time we spoke before the wedding, he said, "Kara wants something elegant, Mom. Nothing over the top. It has to be tasteful." Tasteful. Was I not tasteful? It was a word that hovered over everything that followed, like perfume that refused to fade. Kara didn't need to say it aloud. I wasn't what she wanted Jake to bring into their new life. I was an antique that didn't match the decor. One day I sent Jake an old photo of him and Harold both in flannel shirts sitting on our porch steps. It was a picture filled with dirt under fingernails and smiles without polish. Jake didn't reply. Days later, he said Kara doesn't really like clutter. The photo I realized had become clutter. Another time, I asked if he needed help with wedding invitations. I still had my address book from when we sent Christmas cards together. He said Kara hired someone. It's handled. He wasn't being cruel. He was just shifting, tilting his life away from the woman who built it toward a woman who didn't know the weight of that labor. The night before the wedding, I left him a voicemail. Simple, heartfelt. Jake, I know tomorrow is a big day. I just want you to know I'm proud of you. No matter where I sit, I'll be watching with all my love, always. He never called back. And when I saw that folding chair next to the trash can, I understood. This wasn't about oversight. This wasn't about error. This was choice. Somewhere along the way, I had become inconvenient. Before the wedding, there were hints, small, delicate shifts in tone. But I had ignored them all, because mothers hope. Mothers believe, even as love recedes like a tide. Jake and I used to talk every Sunday. He'd call in the morning while I was making tea, and I'd hear his voice before the kettle even whistled. We talked about everything, nothing was too mundane, but ever since he got engaged to Kara, the calls became shorter, scarcer. Then they stopped. At first I thought it was the wedding stress. Everyone said wedding planning could be overwhelming, so I made excuses on his behalf. He must be tired. Maybe Kara needed more attention. He'll come around after the ceremony. Things will go back to normal. But things didn't go back to normal. I remember the day he told me Kara didn't think it was appropriate for me to help plan the rehearsal dinner. She has a certain aesthetic, he said, as if I were a clashing color. That sentence echoed in my chest for days. I had cooked every meal of his childhood, hosted birthdays on a shoestring budget, built a home from secondhand chairs and hand-me-down blankets. Now my style, my love wasn't beautiful enough. They didn't say it out loud. But they didn't have to. I was being edged out. Kara never spoke to me with cruelty. It was colder than that. She simply didn't see me. I was an accessory to Jake's past, not part of their future. She spoke around me, not to me. She smiled politely, but avoided eye contact. When I offered her a gift, a family recipe book I'd spent months assembling, she accepted it with a thanks and placed it in a drawer. It was never mentioned again. Jake changed too. His sentences grew shorter, his tone more formal. When I asked about his life, he replied in summaries. When I mentioned memories, he changed the subject. One day I asked if he remembered the treehouse we built together. He paused, then said, "Yeah, vaguely." Vaguely. That word hurt more than silence. I began to question myself. Had I loved him too tightly? Had I failed to let go? Or had I raised a son who learned how to edit out the inconvenient chapters of his own story? The final sign came during the seating arrangement. Jake emailed me to confirm my attendance and added, almost like an afterthought, "You'll be seated near the back by the refreshments. It's easier logistically." I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I just understood. My presence was no longer a joy. It was an obligation. And obligations, when love fades, are handled with as little friction as possible. As the wedding approached, I packed my bag slowly. I chose a dress that was elegant but simple. I practiced my smile in the mirror, reminding myself to be gracious, invisible, easy to handle. On the flight there, I stared out the window and tried to believe that maybe, just maybe, it would be different. That maybe Jake would see me. That maybe a hug would tell me I still mattered. But deep down, a quiet voice had already begun to whisper. Prepare to be a guest at your own son's life. Prepare to smile through vanishing. Prepare to love someone who has chosen to forget the parts of him that came from you. The wedding program was glossy, elegant, and heavy in my lap, embossed with gold foil that glinted under the late afternoon sun. I turned each page with a mixture of awe and dread, wondering where, if at all, I would appear. My fingers paused halfway through over the section labeled Family Acknowledgements. There were photos of Kara's parents holding her as a baby, a paragraph about how they supported her dreams, and even a quote from her father about the day he first met Jake. Then came Jake's side, a single picture of him in his college cap and gown. No mention of Harold, no mention of me. I blinked. My heart pounded, hoping I'd somehow missed something. But no, I had not been forgotten. I had been removed. The speeches began shortly after the toasts were poured. The wedding planner, all smiles, asked everyone to take their seats. I was still near the bar, hovering at the edge of a crowd that didn't seem to see me. Kara's father gave the opening toast. He was charming, heartfelt. He spoke about Kara's strength, her ambition, how Jake was lucky to have found someone so exceptional. Everyone clapped. Jake stood next. His voice trembled with emotion as he thanked Kara's parents. He called them inspiring, selfless, and said they had welcomed him like a son. He didn't look in my direction, not once. Not when he said thank you to the people who raised us. Not when he said family is everything. I didn't know what stunned me more, that I wasn't acknowledged, or that no one else seemed to notice. I could feel eyes glance past me like I was a stray thread on a tailored suit. I smoothed my skirt and looked down at my plate. The meal came and went. It was beautifully plated but cold. No one offered to switch my seat. No one refilled my glass. When the photographer started calling for group photos, I perked up. Finally, I thought, this is when I'll be brought in. Family portraits. Surely I belong there. But the photographer said, bride and groom's immediate family only, please. Kara's family assembled, quickly arranged like porcelain dolls in a magazine. Her mother stood beside her, arm wrapped tightly around her daughter. Jake stood alone. The photographer looked around. Any parents of the groom? Silence. Jake scratched his neck, then muttered, let's just do this one. We're on a schedule. And the camera clicked. That shutter sound was louder than thunder. I didn't even flinch. I just turned away slowly and walked toward the garden path. By the time they cut the cake, I was sitting under a tree watching from afar. My heels dug into the dirt, my palms clenched on my lap. There had been no dance for the mother of the groom, no mention in the vows, no seat at the table. They hadn't just ignored me. They had erased me. And yet the ache in my chest wasn't from being forgotten. It was from realizing that Jake had allowed it. That somewhere in his journey to adulthood, he had traded the woman who raised him for the woman he married. I wanted to scream, to stand on a chair and shout, I made that man you just married. I loved him when no one else did. But I didn't. Because what would that prove? Instead, I walked into the empty restroom, locked myself in a stall, and cried into the tissue I had kept in my purse. The one I had embroidered with tiny blue flowers meant to give to Kara as a peace offering. She never looked at it. I looked at myself in the mirror. My lipstick had faded. My eyes were swollen. I didn't recognize the woman staring back. I walked out of that room and didn't stop walking until I was back at my car. I left the gift. I'd brought a handmade quilt of Jake's childhood shirts on the steps outside the reception hall, and I drove away. Not a single person stopped me. Not even my son. By the time the music swelled into the couple's first dance, I was already halfway to the parking lot. I walked slowly, my heels crunching against the gravel, the pale blue dress brushing against my calves like whispers from a life that no longer fit me. I didn't look back, not at the laughter drifting from the ballroom, not at the shadows of people swaying inside, and especially not at the boy who once clung to my hand but now couldn't find me in a crowd of strangers. I had stayed longer than I should have. I had smiled through betrayal. I had waited for redemption that never came. As I sat in my car, the interior still warm from the sun, I gripped the steering wheel with both hands. My knuckles turned white. I hadn't cried yet, not fully. I hadn't let it happen. But in that quiet space surrounded by memories stitched into silence, I allowed the grief to rise. And it did. It came in slow, jagged waves, first in the chest, then in the throat, until finally it spilled through clenched teeth and wet cheeks. I didn't sob. It wasn't dramatic. It was the kind of crying that doesn't ask for comfort, the kind that accepts no answers. It was mourning. Mourning the loss of a role I had nurtured for 3 decades. Mourning a connection I had thought unbreakable. Mourning a boy I had raised with everything I had only to become invisible on the most important day of his life. The stars blinked overhead as I turned the key and drove slowly through the vineyard gates. My headlights cast long, lonely shadows across the road. No one called after me. No one noticed. When I got home, I didn't turn on the lights. I walked through the hallway, stepping out of my heels, letting my purse drop with a soft thud. I sat down at the kitchen table, the same one where Jake used to do his homework, where I had once cut his sandwiches into triangles because he said they tasted better that way. There, I finally looked at the framed photo on the wall, Jake at age 5, arms thrown around my neck, both of us covered in finger paint. His smile in that picture was pure and full of love. Where had that boy gone? I opened the small wooden box I kept tucked in the drawer beneath the sink. Inside were all the little pieces of his childhood. I had kept a dried macaroni necklace, a note he wrote at age 7 that said, I love you more than chocolate, and the first tooth he lost. I held them in my hands and wept, not for myself, but for the woman I had been. She deserved better. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on the couch watching the light creep across the walls as dawn approached. With every hour, the pain settled in a little deeper, but so did something else. Something that had no name yet. A sensation like release. By morning, I felt different. Empty, yes, but also clear. There's a moment after devastation where you understand that no one is coming to fix what's broken. That healing isn't a reunion. It's a reckoning. I stood up, went to my room, and slowly removed the dress. I folded it neatly and placed it in a box. I took off my makeup each stroke of the cloth, wiping away a version of myself that no longer needed to wait at a door that never opened. Then I did something unexpected. I made tea. Real tea, loose leaves steeped with care. I sat by the window and sipped it barefoot and still in yesterday's pain but upright, breathing. For the first time in years, I didn't ask myself what Jake would need today. I didn't run through lists of groceries or birthdays or bills. I just sat there, and I existed. Alone, not abandoned, alone. There's a difference. The morning after, I stood in front of the mirror not to fix myself, but to truly look. For years, I had measured my worth in Jake's milestones, in the way his face lit up when he accomplished something, in the subtle but certain pride I felt being his mother. But now that pride was buried beneath ashes. I was done being invisible. That morning, I did something I hadn't done in years. I opened a blank page on my computer and began to write. It started as a journal entry, a release, a scream typed in silence. I wasn't invited to my son's wedding. I was there, but I wasn't seen. I poured my heart onto the page, the erased name, the seat by the trash can, the photos. I wasn't part of the speech that rewrote his life without me in it. It wasn't polished. It wasn't eloquent, but it was honest. And then, without overthinking it, I posted it anonymously to an online forum for parents. I didn't expect a response, but it came, in thousands. Comments flooded in from mothers, fathers, children, even strangers. Some shared similar stories, others sent digital hugs. A few simply wrote, "I see you." Those 3 words became a lifeline. For years, I had only been seen through Jake, Jake's mom, the single mother who made it work, the background character. Now, for the first time, people saw me as Clara. Offers came in from podcasters, bloggers, even a therapist who invited me to speak at her online grief circle. I said yes, not because I needed validation, but because I needed to reclaim my voice. And I found it. The first time I told my story aloud, I shook. My son's wedding made me realize I had disappeared from his story long before that day. I kept thinking if I loved hard enough, sacrificed deep enough, I would always have a place. But love is not a guarantee of inclusion. Silence followed my words, and then came the tears from the audience, from myself. What I didn't expect was that in telling my truth, I was helping others tell theirs. One woman came up to me after and said, "You've given me permission to stop apologizing for wanting to be remembered." Another said, "You reminded me that I'm allowed to be angry and still be kind." I started writing more. Not about Jake specifically, but about womanhood, motherhood, and the long road of returning to yourself when the world tries to edit you out. My voice, once hoarse from silence, was gaining strength. Then one day, Jake's name popped up in my inbox. It was a short message. "Mom, I saw the post. I don't know what to say, but I'm sorry. Can we talk?" I stared at the screen for what felt like an hour, and then I closed the laptop. Not out of anger, but because I needed more time. I needed to decide whether I wanted to reopen a door that had closed so loudly. Healing had made me stronger, not softer, not more accommodating, just more myself. I wasn't ready to be Jake's mother again, but I was ready to be Clara, fully, boldly, finally. After the wedding, the days bled into one another like ink on wet paper. I kept thinking I had imagined it, that the seat by the trash can wasn't deliberate, that the missing photo and unspoken name were just oversights in a whirlwind day. But denial has a short lifespan when paired with silence. Jake didn't call. Not the next morning, not the next week. Not even a quick, half-hearted thank you text for the quilt I left outside the reception hall. I told myself he was busy, newly married, adjusting. But deep down I knew. This wasn't forgetfulness. It was distance, intentional, tidy. I began to recall all the little signs I had ignored. The subtle shift in tone, the quiet tension in Jake's voice whenever I asked about the wedding. The way Kara always referred to me in the third person when I was in the room. "Has your mom decided where she's staying?" instead of asking me directly. They had built a new world, and I was not meant to live in it. It started even before the wedding. Jake had once been the kind of boy who called just to hear my voice. He would ask me about my day, about my dreams, even about the books I was reading. But after he met Kara, our conversations became efficient. Edited. Hey, Mom, just checking in. All good here. Talk soon. He was polite, kind even, but the warmth. The easy laughter it faded, replaced by something more measured, more careful. Kara was poised, refined. Her world was curated, no clutter, no surprises, no frayed edges. And I was all frayed edges. Homemade cookies instead of catered desserts, thrifted clothes instead of designer blouses, memories instead of modernity. I didn't fit her palette. I remember offering to help with the wedding favors. I had dozens of small jars I'd saved over the years, perfect for homemade jams or honey. Kara smiled tight-lipped and said, "That's sweet, but we've already ordered something a bit more elevated." Elevated. I started to feel like a project, a piece to smooth over. Jake would say, "She's just not used to big families," or, "You know how she is with aesthetics." But what about how I was? I stopped offering after that. One night I dreamt of Jake as a toddler. He was standing in our old kitchen, his hands covered in flour, proudly presenting the crooked pie we made together. In the dream, I bent down and kissed his cheek, and he whispered, "Don't forget me, Mommy." I woke up in tears, because in the real world, it was he who was forgetting, or maybe not forgetting, maybe choosing. At the rehearsal dinner, I tried to talk to Kara, just the two of us. I asked if she was happy, if she felt ready. Her eyes darted past me before landing again. "Yes," she said flatly. "Jake and I are excited for the future." But I wasn't in that future. Not really. Not beyond a name on an invitation they had no intention of saying aloud. I began to feel like furniture. Familiar, functional, but ultimately replaceable. I once told Jake that being a mother was like building a house you'd never live in. You lay every brick, raise every beam, and when it's finally done, someone else moves in. But I had at least hoped for a spare key. Instead, they changed the locks. I tried to bring it up gently once. I asked, "Is everything okay? You've seemed distant." Jake sighed, distracted. "Mom, things are just hectic. Don't take it personally." But how else was I supposed to take it? When I brought up the guest list, he brushed it off. "It's Kara's vision. I'm just showing up." And that was the moment I realized my son, my beautiful boy, was no longer standing beside me. He was standing beside someone who didn't know our story. And worse, didn't want to. It wasn't about hating me. It was about erasing the parts of Jake that came from me. The messy, loving, imperfect parts. The night before the wedding, I sat in the hotel room alone, staring at the dress I'd chosen months ago. It was soft blue, modest, and carefully pressed. I had imagined Jake seeing me in it, smiling and saying, "You look beautiful, Mom." But that moment never came. I went to the ceremony not as a mother of the groom, but as a tolerated guest. And when I took my seat beside that metal trash can, a part of me snapped. Not out of anger, but out of clarity. I had spent my whole life building a bridge to my son, but he had walked to the other side and never looked back. Love, I learned that day, doesn't always echo back, and silence. Sometimes it's a louder answer than words ever could be. A year had passed since the wedding. The garden I once planted in silence had bloomed and faded twice, teaching me more about renewal than any apology ever could. And then one morning, a letter arrived. Jake's handwriting, neat, familiar. "Mom, I've thought of you every day. I know it's late. I know I hurt you. But I want you back in my life if you'll come. Please." I sat with that letter in my hands for a long while. Once that plea would have sent me racing toward him, arms open, heart wide. But this time I didn't run. I breathed. I wrote back the same day. No edits, no hesitation. "Jake, I forgave you long ago. Not because you asked, but because I needed peace. But forgiveness does not mean return. I have learned to love myself more than I wait to be loved by others. Be well. Mom." And then I packed a small bag, bought a one-way ticket, and flew to Ireland, somewhere I'd always dreamed of going but never had the courage to visit. This morning I stood on the edge of a cliff, the wind wild and untamed like me. My skirt flared behind me. My hands were steady. There was no sadness in my chest. Just the thrill of choosing myself finally without guilt. I wasn't waiting anymore for calls, for invitations, for someone to remember I mattered. I remembered, and I was enough. I smiled into the wind, closed my eyes, and let it lift my face. This wasn't the ending I had planned. It was better. This was mine.